Many of South Africa's small, medium-sized micro enterprises are not insured, compounding any attempts of recovery from those damaged in the recent riots. Survey done by Small Business Institute SBI revealed last year that as many as 55,000 SMMEs may not make it through the COVID-19 pandemic. With the recent unrest, that number is expected to rise, according to SBI Chief Executive John DeLue. More than 200 malls have been looted or destroyed and over 600 stores burnt or damaged thus far, the South Africa Property Owners Association said on Wednesday. For more on these stories, we're going to cross over to London, where we're joined by David Belle, founder of Macrodesiac and Growth Director for TradingView UK. David, thank you so much for joining us. Kicking off with China, what do you make of the GDP data coming out from the second largest economy in the world?
Well, I think from my perspective and what I've been looking at, it is telling me that the Chinese credit pulse had peaked back in the first quarter of this year. And so this GDP growth kind of slowing is expected from my point of view. The issue is that I believe that US Treasuries have become very, very sensitive to China. And we've seen a decoupling of Treasury yields versus inflation. And so this is why we're really seeing US Treasury yields face some downside pressures. Now there's a lot of inflation talk, but I think the real driver of US Treasury yields is in fact this decrease in Chinese GDP, because it's seen as a risk event. It's seen as, growth slowing globally, because China is a big growth driver throughout the world. So people want to seek safety in US Treasuries.
Great stuff. Thank you for that. Still with China, the U.S. Senate banning imports from Xinjiang. Will this inflame tensions between the two most powerful economies in the world?
I think so, yeah. But at the same time, it feels to me like a bit of a vanity project. I believe the US understand that China, it might be controversial to say this, but they don't exactly tell the truth about everything. And so I'd argue that it's more of a vanity project to show that they're trying to do something. What's stopping them really from saying that goods weren't produced in Xinjiang, for example? The onus is on the importers. Now, pardon me, but when it comes to business, I don't believe that people necessarily have their morals in the right place. And so I'm not sure that importers would actively seek out necessarily to see where goods are coming directly from.
Thanks for that, David. What do you make of the bullish call from the JP Morgan analysts on Asian stocks?
Yeah, so I just mentioned that the yield in US Treasuries was decreasing. Now, what happens here is it actually makes slightly more risky stocks more attractive to hold. Because if your risk-free rate of return is decreasing, then you're looking for yield somewhere else. And emerging market economies, whether you call China an emerging market or not, they're going to face the benefit of that from foreign investors. So I do see where the analyst is coming from there, especially when over the last couple of weeks, we've seen the CCP, for example, the PBOC as well, come down on Chinese tech firms so heavily, so the drop in the Hang Seng earlier this week. And so, yeah, I totally see it as a nice contrarian call, especially when, Asian stocks at the moment, specifically Chinese, are so hated.
Thanks for that, David. Over to the UK, where you are. What's your take on the labour market data from the Office of National Statistics? Is it encouraging?
Absolutely encouraging. It really is. But the one thing that I think tends to be excluded from a lot of the unemployment data points, and what isn't really shown, is the participation rate of the economy. It's still down on pre-pandemic levels, so people have literally taken themselves out of the workforce. And so I think that should now be the metric that we should really place optimism on if it's increasing, rather than necessarily the unemployment rate itself. Because, central banks and governments might look at full employment just from a kind of a changed metric almost from pre-pandemic levels. So it's optimistic, but I'd still be tentative about how broad the recovery would be.
Thanks, David. Over to South Africa. We're going around the globe here. What do you make of the South Africa riots and the data on too few SMEs being insured and what they're going through right now with those riots?
Well, firstly, my thoughts go out to everyone in South Africa. From what I've seen across social media, it really, really looks terrible. And it's such a shame that it's got to this situation. I think people have put a lot of emphasis on it being due to, pro-Zuma supporters, but really it's down to the government's reaction to, the support that they've provided to people over this really, really tricky period of the last year. Not many SMEs sure that will absolutely be a drag on growth. I can see that being a real issue. Both on a consumption level and also, a credit worthiness level. Things like this can really affect credit ratings, I guess, of businesses. And in the current climate, it might make it real hard to recover. So it's a shame that there hasn't been more emphasis on businesses taking out insurance. But, the supply side shocks like we've had over the last year, you might not factor that in. You might not factor this into your kind of business model. So I can also understand why people wouldn't have taken insurance. They just didn't expect anything like the last year to happen. And of course, now we're seeing the unrest from the poor reaction of the government.
Thanks, David. Jerome Powell, while he was testifying to Congress yesterday, said the U.S. economy is a long way off, quote unquote, from the Fed changing its policy direction. What do you make of his comments and I guess what the Fed holding steadfast so far?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mentioned previously about the inflation narrative decoupling from yields. And I think that what the bond market specifically is telling us right now is that the Fed aren't really going to lift off. They're not really going to increase interest rates or taper at the pace that people perceived them to potentially be at earlier in the year. I think there's a lot of caution going on. And I've held a view from the start of the year that inflation certainly will be transitory. And I think a lot of market participants kind of misunderstood the word transitory. Of course, you can have a period of much higher inflation. Whether that will continue into the long term is a totally different story. And if the Fed were to move too quickly to raise rates, then that could create a real recovery drag in 2-4 years' time.
Founder of Macrodesiac and the Growth Director for TradingView UK, David Belle, thank you so much for taking us through those headlines. Appreciate your insights, David.